Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1335, closer to the bottom. The context here is that the Rebbe Rashab is explaining the third level of sweetening of Gevurah, but he got into a deeper understanding of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim, which we evoke on Yom Kippur, which were revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu as he stood on the mountain, on the rock. And he explained what the rock was and the space that God created, all being the source, ultimately, of all of existence, as it's rooted in the Rishima, which is rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi. And as such, the rock is called the level of Butzina de Kardonisa, the dark or the strong or hard place or hard light or strong light, Gevurah de Atik. And from there is the root of the 13 attributes of compassion. So he asked the question, 13 attributes of compassion, why they call that when they're coming from Gevurah? And especially we're talking about compassion that's unbridled, Rachmim Pshutim. So he explained there's two definitions in the word Gevurah. One from the word Simsum and limit, constraint, and one from Tagbeirus Achayis, an abundance, an intensity of energy. And we've been learning now all kinds of manifestations and demonstrations of that second level of Gevurah. The first example he gave for it was between the difference between docile cattle and wild or aggressive animals, which are, the chayis is much more intense, much more gevurah. In a human being, it's like the blood. So the rushing blood, the heightened blood is also causes more energy. Same thing in the hashpah. When we're talking about hashpah sasechel. So when it's seichel itself can be cool and calm and collected, but then when you communicate it, especially in words, it comes with a passion, the fire of the heart, the passion of the heart. Creates much more excitement in the listener. Then he said, Oidesh Hefresh. That Gevurah, the Gevurah, this intensity also adds actually something new that is not there in the original idea as you understand and conceive it. When it's communicated, it says, Yisra b'shefa seichel. We see that something new. There'll be a schachus, something new will be innovated. So all this is examples of this tagbeirus of Gevurah. And that led to another thing that Gevurah also causes, that the hashpah should be bligvul, incessant and unlimited, and should not cease. Whereas from Chasodim alone, it could have a limit, the flow. And he gave for that example, like by birth, that comes from Gevurah, birth has the power to perpetuate generations. Day to day is bligvul. And the same thing is when a soul comes down below, you need vayipach ba'apov. You need a strong, intense energy to take a neshama from the spiritual state and put it into a physical body, lamata mata. And so that's both to the intensity necessary of Gevurah, necessary to bring it there, to flow in an unlimited way, but also to come down lamata mata to the lowest level, exactly as it is above. Well, I should correct myself. Exactly as it is above, he actually used earlier that Chesed does not add anything. The way it is above, that's how it comes down below. Gevurah adds something. So let me just correct that last line. And finally, the last thing we learned, I believe, was so you see Gevurah is connected to longevity, to 80 years, not just 70 years. So it's all about an intensity of Gevurah. That's where we stopped. So I'm going to continue learning from 8 lines at the bottom of page 1335. Where he continues this discussion now on this Tagbeirus Achayis, this intense energy in the second interpretation of Gevurah. And see where this leads us to. So he continues like this. Now there's another difference between Chasodim and Gevurahs. So in the beginning of the paragraph, he said, Oid yesh hefresh. Now he said there's yet another difference between Chasodim, the kindness or the love of Chesed, which flows forward, and Gevurah, and Gevuros. The Gevuros boim bebchinas ischalkus. Here's the difference. Gevuros come in with distinction. It breaks down into parts. Mashenken Chasodim, where Chasodim is all unified, is one unit. Going back to the example of water. Remember, water is always the example for Chesed. So when water falls from a higher place to a lower place, water descends. It flows in one flow. So if you see a waterfall or you see anywhere where water is rushing, you don't see it broken into parts. It flows in one continuous flow, one unified flow. Gevurah is buying b'pchinas pirud v'yischalkus. The flow through Gevurah, when Gevurah is involved in the process, the hashpah comes b'pirud, separate parts, v'yischalkus, and distinguished parts. Ukumay hadibur, going back to the example of speech, that when the seichel comes into speech, so on one hand, yes, it comes shabab b'ribui oisiz v'tzirufim. It comes into a multitude of words, of letters, and combinations of letters. Ukamay Gevuros gshamim sheyerdin tipin tipim. Like the expression is Gevuros gshamim, that the rain is compared to Gevurah, even though rain is water. So if you're talking about water running without Gevurah, it would just be a flood. That's why you need Gevuros gshamim, to turn them into raindrops. And that's the distinction. When Nechemia and Magal prayed for rain, the Gemara in Tainus, because it was a drought, he was praying for rain. So the rain started coming down in floods. It started flooding the fields. So he prayed again and said, Reif teva ein yechelem lekabel. The water's destroying the field just as bad as when it's a drought. Flooding the fields also destroys the crops. So he prayed again that the water should come down in a way, piece by piece, so to speak, piecemeal, drop by drop. So we see from this that Chesed is just a flow. Gevurah breaks it down into parts. In the context of rain, like raindrops. Tipin tipim, sheyerdin tipim tip, they descend drop by drop. In the context of Hashpa'as HaSeichel, the Gevurah takes the Seichel, the flow of Chesed of Seichel, and breaks it into parts, which is what words are. Gevuros, that's why we say the Hey Gevuros are the Hey Mitzvah Sapeh. He doesn't spell it out, but in other places he says, what is speech actually? The Hey Mitzvah Sapeh are the five, what do we call them? Linguals, the five gutturals. So it's the lips, the palate, the teeth, the cheeks, and the throat. So different letters have different expressions. That's what words are. They break down something into parts. And that comes through Gevuros. Okay. Omnom. Now, you can say, one second, isn't this somewhat like different than what we said till now? We're talking about Gevurah is bligvul, incessant. It doesn't stop the flow. And it goes all the way down. I'm not asking a question. I'm just pointing out that he's bringing different angles, and he's going to explain. Omnom. His chalkus zeis, however, this distinction, this breakdown that Gevurah does, that breaks things into parts, he ba mitzad his gabrus, his hatagberis, I'm sorry. This comes due to the intensity. It's not in despite of it, it's because of it. V'hainu, what does that mean? That his chalkus eine beginnes Gevurah v'tzimtzum, shu beginnes miud v'heder ha'er. The breaking down is not about diminishing it and limiting it, diminishing it, and refraining and limiting, or what's the heder would be the opposite of transmitting, withholding light. That's not the pshat of Ischalkus. When you say the rain comes down and drops, you're not saying you're diminishing the water. You're just making it come down in a way that it can be contained. But it can be the same amount of water as it would be coming down, rushing down, if it wasn't a flood. So he's talking about the second thing in Gevurah. It's coming due to its intensity. Every transmission that comes with the intensity of atzmos. It comes dafke in a form of of distinctions, of breaking down. I'm going to explain this, but let's read it inside and I'll explain it more in detail. It's a very fascinating topic that is the Rebbe would cite often from the Mittler Rebbe, that the ultimate ischalkus comes from the ultimate pshittus, that the greater the force, the more it breaks down into more parts. So it sounds paradoxical. You'd think ischalkus is more on a lower level where there's less oil, so there's more distinctions. That's true on some levels. But there's also the other way around, that due to something coming from such a high place, it also divides it infinitely as well. See, that the Mittler Rebbe's words are that from infinity comes also infinite amount of hischalkus, endless, limitless and endless distinctions. And that's why, because it's coming from such an intense place, every piece, every part comes bli gvul, v'shir. It's without limits or shir, meaning no limit and shir in the distinctions. Like when we say that human beings are different from one another. They have 8 billion people, no two faces are alike, no two are saying Shabbos. Where's that coming from? Is that coming from a limitation or is that coming from a higher power? That's coming from a higher power that can literally be expressed in infinite ways. So the infinite ways is still an expression of tagberis, of the gevurah, of the ba'atzmos. The kol chelik, and not only that, but every piece, every part, has fundamentally a tremendous amount of energy and power and light. Next page, 1336. Like when we see the fall, like we see in rainfall, when rain falls, every drop of the rain, it comes with vitality. There's no diminishment in it. In other words, it's water that will be absorbed by the earth and will make things grow. Yes, it's only one drop. So in quantity, it's limited in contrast to, let's say, just a flooding, a deluge or a flood of water. But the tipa itself doesn't lack vitality. It's not like it's like you would say a limited energy. It's filled, it's chayis, ve'ein b'shum miyat klal. He means miyat here in echus, not in kamos. But since it's coming with such intensity, that's why it breaks it down. You know, it's interesting. I think it's something that we all experience, a phenomenon that when you pour something, you have to pour it with a certain control, or else what will happen? It'll splash everywhere. So if you want it to flow properly, you actually don't want to have the intensity. If someone, let's say, takes a big pitcher of water and just uses tagbeirus achayis and just like with all intensity, where will happen with the water? It will split, it'll splash all over the place. It'll break down into so many parts. You actually need to limit the tagbeirus. In other words, to pour it with a certain limited amount of intensity. I'm just pointing out that even physically you see this. So when there's too much tagbeirus, comes a beschalkus, and it breaks down into many details. Like we see in the flow of intelligence. When it's coming with an intensity from the source of intelligence. Then it comes in very brief, summarized ideas. And they have tremendous amount of power and energy in them. And the flow is literally unlimited. B'riboy sichlim, with a multitude of ideas, u'be'emek acher emek, and a depth deeper than another depth, a depth after a depth. So in other words, when a person, let's say, not even a genius, when a person has their channels, their intellectual, creative channels are open, and it's flowing with full intensity, it won't be expressed in a long way. It'll be very short, brief, intense thoughts or ideas, but each one is coming each one is coming with a tremendous amount of potency, and it's flowing many different ideas. It's like basically unfiltered, and that unfiltered is actually coming into many details, as opposed to one idea. When the seichel, once it's not flowing from that intense way, but it's expanding now. Like when you start expanding an idea, so when you take an idea and you start explaining it, let's say to a student or to yourself even, now you've already moved away from the source, from that intensity of the source. So now it doesn't have that much intense energy. And the ideas also have parameters, have an edge, have an end and a limit. The ad poisove. It doesn't just flow without any stop. I think they say, like what they say, I think the Magid, the Mittler Rebbe, that sometimes they'd say shah to themselves while they were teaching, saying a mimer. And later we were told that the reason was because the Neviah, the flow was so intense, they had to quiet it down and silence it. It was too much for them. Meaning it just keeps on, more ideas and more ideas. To put it in more psychological terms, if we didn't have chemicals that create some type of compartmentalization of our ideas, we would go mad. If your creative energies just flowed without like a faucet or regulator that limits the flow or somewhat contains it, the intensity of it would just start pouring so many ideas you wouldn't be able to stop. So essentially, when it's closer to the source that's coming with that intensity, it breaks into parts. As it begins to be developed and expanded, that's when you limit it. So what he's basically saying here is that Tagberis creates an intensity that's also Bli Gvul, and it's in breaking into unlimited components. So it does turn the whole idea upside down, because usually we think of Chesed that way. Chesed is Bli Gvul, it's a flow, and Gevurah limits the flow. That's true in the first interpretation of Gevurah. But the second interpretation of Gevurah, we're talking about the Gevurah that comes from intensity, where Chesed is much more cool and calm, like we spoke. That intensity, when it's in full force, has essentially it's unlimited intensity and therefore unlimited breakdown of details, like he's explaining now. This is Hispashtus HaSeichel, when the Seichel expands and is being developed. It's not the flow, the essential flow, but the flow of intelligence. Shu kemayin hamizgaber. The expression mayin hamizgaber, like a spring that's overpowering and overwhelming. Like we would say when you see a teacher or a rebbe just going on and more ideas and more ideas. And we say mayin hamizgaber. You say like a mayin, a spring of water, a source of water that is just mizgaber, more and more and more. It's endless. It's relentless. Hariboim ribuy sichlim chadoshim. Many new ideas come out of this. Vehem bekitzer dafke, and they're dafke in a very brief. They're very concentrated, like in drops. Bischalkus, and separated in a state of separation and distinction. And every part of it has a tremendous amount of potent energy. V'hainu mipnei and this is all to the fact that the difference that he's speaking between Chesed and Gevurah, that the intensity of Gevurah is the cause for this breakdown. So it also breaks things apart in this intense, powerful way. So that's yet another distinction between Chasodim and Gevurahs. I mean, another example would be kipati shifetz tzela. So we use that pasuk kipati shifetz tzela is like a hammer that when you strike at the anvil, what happens is sparks fly. The stronger you strike it, the more sparks fly. This Rashi brings, and it's brought in different places of where one pasuk in Chumash could have many interpretations. If you apply that type of intensity, that will be, if you don't hit it that hard, there's not so much Gevurah in it, you're not going to have so many sparks. But when you strike something very hard, the sparks fly in all different directions and all kinds of ideas grow out of it. That's another, he doesn't use this here, but that would be another example. Okay. So let me pause here for any questions or comments. That's the new example, the new difference, the additional difference between Chasodim and Gevuros, or Gevuros and Chasodim. And we still have not come back to what this is all leading to. So obviously, there's more to go here. Everybody's good? No questions? Okay. So let's continue. V'zehu v'arbe ezarei ve'eten lei es Yitzhok. V'arbe ezarei means, and I will multiply his children and give them to Yitzhok. So he explains, what is this to connect? He's going to say, this is the ribui, this multitude that's connected to Gevurah, which is Yitzhok. He says like this, Arba b'gematria Yitzhok. The word Arba is the gematria of Yitzhok, 208. Is that right? Yeah. Yud and Tzadik is 100, Ches is 8, 108, and Kuf is 208. Lies, why? Because Yitzhak ubchinas ha'gevurah kaneda. Yitzhak is known as Gevurah. Yeah, Avram is Chesed, Yitzhak is Gevurah, and Yaakov is Tiferes. That's why it says Pachad Yitzhak, the fear or the Gevurah of Yitzhak. L'chein nemer boi v'arba. And that's why by him, by Yitzhok Dafke, it says Va'arba, multiply his children, his offspring, his pedigree, because Yitzhok and Arba are the same, are the same level. Why? The Inyan Haribui who based Dvarim. When you say Va'arba Ribui, many, the multitude includes two things. Echad she'ein hefsik lam shachase. One is Ribui in the context of longevity, that there's no hefsik, there's no pause to its transmission. It's not limited. So it's like what he calls Ribui Loshen Rav V'Godl. Kamoy Kirabo Kigodla. So here Ribui is not in the necessarily in a number, but something great and powerful, something that goes on, that lasts, that's everlasting. Like basically a qualitative ribui. V'abeis, she beribui, v'yischalkus b'chalokim ktanim, beribui, kumay tipus hamotar. And the second is actually a breakdown of many details. So ribui could mean an ongoing flow that doesn't stop. It could also mean, and another meaning that it means that it breaks down, and ribui means a multitude of many details. B'chalokim tanim, it breaks down to many small parts. B'ribui, many small parts. U'kamoy tipus hamotar, like the drops of rain, like you mentioned before. V'shneim, and both these aspects. So in other words, we could say this. You could have ribui only of the second sort, where you'd have many, let's say many children, but they wouldn't necessarily, God forbid, perpetuate. You could have one child that perpetuates and goes on for generations. When you say here, Arba is referring to both. That'll go on for generations and there'll be many a number. And both these meanings and of ribui are coming from the intensity of the flow. The mishum zeh bo beribui hachayis uberibui hamshocha ad lamata mata. That due to this intensity, it comes beribui hachayis with much energy and vitality, uberibui hamshocha and much transmission all the way down below. Essentially, he's referring to both things, both intensity as in quality, and in quantity. Doesn't say quality and quantity, so maybe I won't use those words. But he does say continuity and many details. I think the mata sounds like continues. But maybe he's not referring to the same two things that he said before. But the bottom line, it's chayes uberibu shachad lamata mata. Umeshum zeh bo gamkein beribu ha'eschalkus. Oh, here's very clear. And because of this, also, it comes in a riba ischalkus in a multitude of details. V'chalokim hem b'chinas gilui. And the chalokim are a form of gilui because each piece is revealing some part. Not sure why he's adding that. Uberiba chalokim aden kitz v'shir. And in a multitude of parts, without limit and measure. V'zeu, and this is the meaning when we say the bracha, the boneh chaya mizena, that blessing, that boneh, having children, chaya, life, and mizena, and sustenance, and food, kulam hem b'chinas ha'gevurah. They all come from the power of Gevurah, which has that intensity that gives the intensity of all of those blessings. The bonai hum b'chinas ha'gevurah k'mashikosa bonai, children, are Gevurah. Actually, he said this earlier, Leda, maybe that's what he's referring to now. The birth. So it says by Yaakov, by Reuven, when he gave birth to this is my strength, and Reishis Eini, and the beginning of my power. So you see from that children are a result of strength and power. Like is discussed at length in the Hagos, the gloss. This is probably the Tzemach Tzedek. And the Maimer Ela Tel des Yitzhok, these are the children of Yitzhok. So Yitzhok is Gevurah, and Tel is referring to that intensity, strength. And it comes into Schalkus Tipin and break down into drops. The Ayin Beis Hagbola. And there's no limits. Now, I'm not sure whether he means, does he mean the drops of seed? Maybe that's what he's referring to. And you see there's no limit because a person technically can give birth to as many possible children as possible. I'm not talking about from the mother's end. From the father's end, the seed. Is that what he means? Schalkus tipin, davke ve'ein b'zakbol, and there's no limit? Most likely that's what he means. So that's bonai. Now comes chaye, life. Chaye u'b'chinas ha'gevurah da'adam hu ha'nefesh. Okay, so he's citing ideas he brought already in the previous page. So life also comes from Gevurah, because dam, which is Gevurah, blood, the warm blood, the fiery blood, the hu ha'nefesh, that's chayes. Ubagam ken b'chinas chalkus. So besides like you see in each one of them, he's explaining both things, that it has power in it, and it also breaks down into parts. This also, life also breaks down into parts. The b'chol rega v'rega nimshach chayes chodesh ma'nefesh. We see every second, the soul, the spirit, is giving new energy, so that is energizing the body anew. V'hu inyan rotzev v'shuv. Where do we see this? The rotzev v'shuv, which is the tension and resolution, or the yearning and returning. Histalkus v'hispashtus. where contraction and expansion of the heart and the exhale and inhale of the breath. So chayis, commotion is bar this. We learned at length in volume 2 that the very chayis in a human being comes through a flow that is constantly being renewed. It's not just you have one breath and one beat of the heart keeps you alive. Every second, you need to have a renewal every moment, or 18 times a minute to be exact, is I think the average. So a person, what is happening? It's a constant flow, ebb and flow, we should say. The heart contracts, the heart expands, the breath exhales, the breath inhales. So that's the Rotze B'Shuv, is Talkus Ispashtus. So you see here, so in addition to Gevurah, the intensity of life, of dam, of blood, there's also the breakdown details, like by Bonai, comes from strength, and also has tipim that go on and break down into infinite details, or endless details. But this breakdown is not limited. It's bli gvul. So then why doesn't a person live forever? So he explains in the parentheses, were it not for the chet etzadas that caused death, a person would have lived forever. So in other words, this energy, the potential is the soul can give energy forever to a human body. The problem is the chet caused death. That's chaya. Then finally, the third is mezena. What about mezena, which is mezenas, which is referring to sustenance, to the food that sustains us? It also comes from Gevurah, like we know, the shulchan. In the Beis Hamikdash, in the Mishkan, there was the three in Kodesh, in the middle, the holy. There were the three main vessels. The menorah, the Dorim. In the south was the menorah. In the Emtza, in the middle, was the altar, the Mizbeach HaZov, which is the Mizbeach HaKteris. And B'tzofin in the north, which if you look the different direction would be to the right, to the north was what? Was the shulchan. What was on the shulchan, on the table? Lechem aponim. The loaves of bread. Because the shulchan represented the amshacha of mezena. It actually says in places that the three vessels represent bona chaya mezena. Mezena is the shulchan. I think chaya is the menorah, and bona is connected to the mizbeach, and I don't remember why, but I remember seeing it somewhere. But regardless, going back to shulchan b'tzofin, and tzofin is always gevurah. Dorim is chesed, south is chesed, that's why it's warmer climates. Tzofin is north, is colder climates, it's more gevurah, it's harsher climate. So shulchan b'tzofin is gevurah. Uba b'bchinas ischalkus, and this too comes in a form of ischalkus, breaks down. L'kol echad ve'echad kefi mizgoy v'tchunose. Because when you sustain someone, you have to give each person according to their makeup and personality. Ube'itei ubizmane, and the right time and the right moment. U'kumoshe kosav, like the pasuk says, va'ata noisen be'itei, that you will give us sustenance be'itei in its right time. Like we say, v'nasati gishmecham be'itam, that you will give the rain in this time. Because if you give the rain in the wrong time, if you give the sustenance in the wrong time, that's equally problematic. So you see, on the contrary, even on one end, the Gevurah comes down and breaks down into each individual and in each right moment. This means a very a multitude of very much distinction and separation. Both in each individual individually, and also and the same took all the creations that God sustains, feeds and sustains, from the horns of the Aimim are not the bulls. Forgot what the name of the Aimim is. Ad, the end of it is even to the small insects. Shezeo mebchinas hagvura. This is all coming from a power of Gevurah. Now I know you'd say, 1 second, isn't Zonu Mafanas like Chesed? It's God's Chesed. Remember, we spoke about Gevurah Sheba Chesed. Yes, there's a Chesed in rain too, but in order for it to come with intensity, and it should be continuous and break down into all kinds of different details, there you need the Gevurah to add that dimension to it. Again, he reports that the riboy is not limited; it's without any measure at all. The kol zeh, all of this is hu mipnei shagvura hu inyan hatagbedas. This is all due to the fact that Gevurah is the intensity, the mitzvah tagbedas hashefa, due to the intensity of the flow. Bo beriboy ischalkus. It comes in a multitude of details, ubebchinas bli gvul, and endless. Uma'achar shaniroyim. And now that we see, and after the fact that we see, shagvura same b'chinas hashpa b'ribui dafke, that Gevurah creates a hashpa b'ribui, multitude hashpa, b'ribui ischalkus. I'm sorry, b'ribui dafke. So then you must say, it compels us to say, sheyilem koyach zeh, ma'achar shaniroyim shagvura b'chinas hashpa b'ribui dafke, behechlech sheyilem koyach zeh b'mokra chetzvam koydem shenimshachu. So then you have to say that they have these multitude, these details, having them in the source of where they were chiseled, which means the source from where they originate, they have this power, even before it actually comes down into actuality. So in other words, they all have in their root a potential that is unlimited, even before it comes down. Because it's originating in a place. It's not like when it comes down, that's when it has all this potency and intensity. All the way in the source of the intensity, so even before it comes down, in the source, it has all this potency, all this power. Bli gvul, so the potential to go unlimited. Mashenk and Chasodim, going back to Chasodim, but in contrast, Chasodim, kindness, love, the flow of water, regular water. Nimdadu gambim kedam. They are measured also in their source. B'chinas midah, a particular measure. L'chein yichla shifam. That's why their flow will cease, will pause, will come to an end. I just want to see, now comes a parentheses, which I see is all the way till the end of the paragraph. Okay. So let me stop, and anybody want to ask anything? Well, the most obvious question that jumps out to me, at least, is that in some places you actually read that Chesed is bli gvul, and Gevurah that's doing the stopping and the pausing and the limiting of the flow. So you have to say that that's according to the first interpretation of Gevurah, not the second. I mean, I can't say 100% for sure, but that's just my initial thought when I'm reading all of this. Because so often you say Chesed is oir bli gvul, and then comes Gevurah tzimtzum shem elikim that limits the flow. But here clearly he's talking about Gevurah, and I'm sure I can't imagine he's not going to refer to this at some point, this element that I just pointed out. So I'm assuming right now is the first interpretation of Gevurah, but then how do you reconcile it with this one? So as I said at the outset, it could be that because Gevurah in its root is so intense, that's why it needs to have the second meaning in Gevurah to limit that intensity. So in other words, there's the Chesed is a flow. Gevurah in its root is tagbedas of full intensity. And then when it comes down in actuality, you need to have the tzimtzum. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm not positive what I'm saying is accurate. I would definitely wait to see, but I'm just anticipate that this may be a question some of you have. So I have this question myself as well. So I'm not sure, but I'd rather reserve any conclusive comments on this until we really finish the subject matter. So I think maybe we'll stop here because the parentheses is not short. And it probably is going to address some of these issues as well. So now comes the parentheses. Yesh leimer, I see. Let me just make sure. Yeah. The parentheses ends at the end of the paragraph on page 1337. So it's a nice 20 line, probably 20, 36. Yeah, like a 17 page, a 17 line parentheses. So I think I'll stop here. Anybody want to ask anything? Any clarity needed? So quiet today. At least let me know that you're around.
We're out here. You're just teaching so clearly. Nobody has any questions.
Okay. And it's also, we all see it's a developing idea. It's going to come to it's going to come to a head soon. I see the next page is where things start getting lebedik, as they say, bring it back to the original topic. Fascinating how he's explaining Gevurah. I mean, this goes back to what I said. In other words, very much the key thing here is to remember that it goes a lot deeper than we usually. Chesed is definitely flow, hashpah. No one's denying that. But it's Gevurah that has that additional thrust. And maybe that's why he's giving all these examples, like an animal or blood or all the other examples that thrust forward, that push, where you need really, what's the word, overpowering element, where you really need to dig deeper and overpower something. So overpower by definition is Gevurah, power. So it's interesting. So Chesed is a force. Gevurah, in first interpretation, is a limitation and like the brakes, but really pushing something very powerfully ahead is takbeirus. But I'm sure we're going to learn about all the balance between them all. We obviously need them all. No one's here. He's not coming to negate the power of Chesed, but he's definitely coming to explain. It's going to be interesting to see also how this fits into the transformation of Gevurah as in Helam, and the darkness and Kalim, and ultimately the Helam Atzmi. Okay.
I think he's doing more of a quantitative difference between Chesed and Gevurah, and when you say this Sheva, this, it's going to be more of a quantitative plus the qualitative.
It could be.
Yeah, it sounds like he's building a case for Gevurah to be a powerful force of creation in its own right, which you wouldn't ordinarily think, because it's counterintuitive. Typically, Gevurah's restriction and kind of firmness, but he's making an argument that it has great force, and that is from which you can have a creative energy from within the Halam Ha'atzmi, from the constraint, from the darkness. There actually is a great, powerful creative force within the darkness. I'm speculating, but that's where I think he's headed. I mean, I don't know. What do I know? No?
Yeah, we'll see. And I think there's merit in what you're saying. It sounds right. But we'll see. It's very. What's good about this is there's no guessing here. He made it very clear that there are two interpretations in Gevurah. If he had just began with the second one and ignored that there's a first one, it would be much more confusing. He made it clear on page 1334 that the Gevurah yesh beis pirushim shein hofchim zemezeh. He actually said they're opposites. So we're on good footing here. Solid footing. Okay. So we'll stop here before the parentheses on page 1336.